Some nights, the dead are more restless than others. I'm Marcus Chen, and I've been working security at Hillcrest Cemetery for 8 years now. Most people think it's a strange job spending 12 hours alone in a place where silence is sacred and darkness stretches between weathered headstones like spilled ink. But honestly, it's peaceful work. The dead don't cause trouble. It's the living you have to watch. For vandals, copper thieves, the occasional drunk who thinks it's funny to stumble through someone's final resting place. Hillcrest spans 43 acres of rolling hills dotted with oak trees and marble monuments. During my shift, which runs from 8 p.m. to 8 a.m., I monitor 16 security cameras positioned throughout the grounds. Most of the time, I see nothing more interesting than raccoons or the occasional deer picking their way between headstones. The control room sits in the maintenance building near the front gattia, small space with banks of monitors, a coffee maker that's older than most of the graves, and a logbook where I record anything unusual. The routine never changes. I arrive at 7:45, check in with Dave, the day shift guard, and settle into my chair. Dave's been here longer than anyone 23 years, and he likes to joke that he knows every ghost by name. He updates me on any maintenance work, reminds me about scheduled deliveries, and heads home to his wife and dinner. Then it's just me, the cameras, and 43 acres of silence. The night I first saw her was a Tuesday in early October. The air had that crisp bite that signals autumn's arrival, and a thin fog was rolling in from the valley. I was making my rounds through the camera pizza habit I developed to stay alert during the quiet hours. Camera 7 covers the older section of the cemetery, where headstones date back to the early 1900s. The image quality isn't great in that area because the trees block some of the infrared lighting, but it's usually enough to spot any movement. At 3:17 a.m., I noticed her. An elderly woman in a blue dress was kneeling beside grave 47B, her gray hair pulled back in a neat bun. She appeared to be placing flowers on the headstone, though the camera angle made it difficult to see clearly. What struck me was how still she was, no fidgeting, no looking around nervously like most people do when they're somewhere they shouldn't be. She knelt there for exactly 4 minutes, then stood and walked calmly toward the tree line where the camera's range ended. I made a note in the logbook. 3:17 a.m., elderly female visitor, section 7, grave 47B. Left flowers. It wasn't unusual for people to visit graves at odd hours. Grief doesn't follow a schedule, but most late-night visitors were younger family members sneaking in to avoid crowds or curious neighbors. This woman moved with the deliberate pace of someone who had every right to be there. The next night, she was back. Same time, same grave, same blue dress. This time I watched more carefully, switching between camera angles to track her movement. She approached from the east side of the cemetery, following the paved path that runs along the maintenance road. Her gait was steady but slow, and she carried what looked like a small bouquet. Again, she knelt for exactly 4 minutes before disappearing into the trees. I decided to drive out and take a look at grave 47B during my morning rounds. The headstone read, Margaret Rose Hoffman, beloved wife and mother, 1924 to 2018. Fresh daisies lay against the granite, still damp with morning dew. Nothing seemed unusual, but something about the woman's visits bothered me. There was a quality to her movement on camera too purposeful, too regular. Grief is chaotic, unpredictable. This felt more like ritual. By the end of the week, I had documented 5 identical visits. Each time, the woman appeared at exactly 3:17 a.m., knelt for 4 minutes, and vanished into the shadows. I mentioned it to Dave during shift change, but he just shrugged and said some people find comfort in routine. Maybe she's the daughter, he suggested. Some families have their own way of dealing with loss. That made sense, so I let it go. But something was nagging at me, a feeling I couldn't shake. During my break on Friday night, I decided to review the recorded footage from the past week. The cemetery's digital system stores everything for 30 days before automatic deletion, and I wanted to get a better look at the woman's face, maybe identify her vehicle. I pulled up Tuesday night's footage and fast-forwarded to 3:17 a.m. The timestamp showed the exact moment I had witnessed, but the screen displayed only empty grass and headstones. No woman in blue, no flowers being placed, just the static tableau of grave 47B under infrared lighting. Confused, I tried Wednesday night's recording. Same result, nothing but an empty gravesite at 3:17 a.m. I checked Thursday, Friday, even scrolled through the entire nights frame by frame. According to the recorded footage, no one had visited grave 47B all week. But I had watched her. 5 nights in a row, I had seen her clear as day on the live monitor. I even had notes in the logbook, written in my own handwriting. The fresh flowers were real. I had seen them, touched them. Yet somehow, the security system had recorded nothing. I spent the weekend researching the cemetery's computer system, wondering if there was some kind of malfunction that affected only the recorded footage while leaving the live feed intact. But everything checked out. The cameras were working perfectly, the hard drives had plenty of space, and the timestamps matched across all 16 feeds. Monday night, I positioned myself in front of camera 7 at 3:15 a.m. Pen in hand, logbook open. At exactly 3:17, she appeared again. I wrote down every detail as I watched. Blue dress with small white flowers printed on the fabric, sensible brown shoes, gray hair in a low bun secured with what looked like a tortoiseshell clip. She carried white daisies bound with a pale ribbon. Her movements were fluid, purposeful, and utterly silent. The next morning, I immediately reviewed the footage. Nothing. The timestamp showed 3:17 a.m., but grave 47B remained empty and undisturbed. That's when I decided to visit the cemetery office and pull the burial records from Margaret Rose Hoffman. The records clerk, a thin woman named Patricia who'd been filing death certificates since the Carter administration, helped me navigate the archive system. We found the paperwork easily enough. Mrs. Hoffman had purchased the plot in 2015, 3 years before her death. But there was a problem. According to the burial records, Margaret Rose Hoffman had never been interred at Hillcrest Cemetery. The plot was purchased, the headstone was installed, but no body was ever buried there. Patricia frowned at her computer screen, clicking through several databases. "That's odd," she muttered. "The family paid for everything. Plot, stone, perpetual care, but there's no record of an actual burial service." She pulled up the death certificate. Margaret Rose Hoffman had died at Mercy General Hospital on November 14, 2018. Cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia. But after that, the paper trail went cold. No funeral home was listed, no burial permit issued. According to the official records, Margaret Rose Hoffman had simply vanished after her death was recorded. "What about family?" I asked. "Someone had to authorize the headstone." Patricia's frown deepened as she scrolled through the contact information. "Payment came from an estate account, but I don't see any family members listed. Just a law firm handling the arrangements." She scribbled down the firm's name and phone number. "This is really unusual, Marcus. In 40 years of record keeping, I've never seen anything like this." I called the law firm that afternoon. The receptionist put me through to the attorney, who had handled Mrs. Hoffman's estate, a tired-sounding man named Robert Kellerman. When I explained my questions about the burial, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Mr. Chen," he said carefully, "I'm not sure what records you're looking at, but Margaret Hoffman was cremated. Her ashes were scattered in the Pacific Ocean according to her wishes. There was never any burial at Hillcrest Cemetery. But the headstone, Mrs. Hoffman had no family, no close friends. She lived alone for the last 15 years of her life. The cemetery plot was purchased years earlier, apparently during a period when she was considering traditional burial, but she changed her mind before her death. The headstone was installed by Mistakea, miscommunication between our office and the cemetery. We've been trying to resolve it for months." The line went quiet except for the sound of papers rustling. Finally, Kellerman spoke again. "Mr. Chen, why are you asking about this? Has someone been visiting the grave?" I told him about the woman in the blue dress, the nightly visits, the flowers. Another long pause. "That's impossible," he said. "Margaret Hoffman died alone. She outlived her husband by 12 years, never had children, and her closest living relative was a nephew in Oregon who hadn't spoken to her since the 1990s. There's no one left who would visit her grave. After I hung up, I sat in my car outside the cemetery office, staring at the neat rows of headstones stretching across the hillside. Somewhere in that maze of marble and granite was plot 47B, where a woman who was never buried received nightly visits from someone who couldn't possibly exist. That night, I positioned Camera 7's monitor directly in front of me and waited. At 3:16 a.m., I called Patricia at home, waking her from a sound sleep. "Patricia, it's Marcus from the cemetery. I need you to stay on the line and listen carefully." At exactly 3:17 a.m., she appeared. The woman in the blue dress approached grave 47B with her armload of white daisies. She knelt in the damp grass, placed the flowers against the headstone, and remained motionless for exactly 4 minutes. "Patricia," I whispered into the phone, "I'm watching someone visit Margaret Hoffman's grave right now. An elderly woman in a blue dress." "Marcus," Patricia's voice was sharp with concern, "that's impossible. I'm looking at the cemetery's live camera feed on my phone right now. Camera 7 shows nothing but an empty gravesite." I stared at the monitor. The woman was still there, clearly visible, her gray hair catching the infrared light. But according to Patricia, Camera 7 showed only darkness and stone. At exactly 3:21 a.m., the woman stood, smoothed her dress, and walked toward the tree line. I watched until she disappeared into the shadows beyond the camera's range. "She's gone now," I told Patricia. "Marcus," Patricia said quietly, "there was never anyone there. I've continued working the night shift at Hillcrest, and she still comes every night at 3:17 a.m. The woman in the blue dress visits a grave that holds no body, mourning someone who has no one left to mourn her. I've stopped writing her visits in the logbook. There's no point documenting something that doesn't exist for anyone else. But sometimes, during those long hours before dawn, I find myself wondering, if Margaret Hoffman died alone and forgotten, with no family to grieve her passing, who is the woman in the blue dress? And why can only I see her keeping vigil at an empty grave? The flowers are always fresh when I check them in the morning. That much at least is real. Some things leave marks that soap and bleach can't wash away. I'm Sarah Martinez, and I've been working as an embalmer at Riverside Funeral Home for 14 years. It's precise work that requires steady hands and a calm disposition, qualities I've cultivated through years of caring for the deceased with the same attention I once gave to the living when I worked as a nurse. The transition from hospital to funeral home wasn't as difficult as people imagine. Death, I've learned, is just another form of patient care. My workspace is in the basement of the funeral home, a sterile environment with white tile walls and fluorescent lighting that never quite feels warm enough. The embalming table sits in the center of the room, stainless steel gleaming under the harsh lights. Above it, mounted on the wall, is a large mirror that allows me to monitor my work from different angles. It's practical equipment, nothing more a tool that helps me ensure every detail is perfect before families say their final goodbyes. The funeral home operates on a predictable schedule. I arrive at 7 a.m., review the day's cases with Mr. Henley, the funeral director, and begin my preparations. Most of my work happens in the morning hours, when the building is quiet and I can focus without interruption. The bereaved families don't typically arrive until afternoon, giving me time to complete the careful process of restoration and preparation that allows loved ones to remember the deceased at their best. My routine never varies. I sanitize the workspace, review the medical information for each case, and begin the methodical work of embalming. It's meditative, in a way, the careful attention to detail, the quiet concentration required to handle someone's final dignity with proper respect. After 14 years, I know every inch of my workspace, every reflection in that mirror, every sound the old building makes as it settles. That's why I noticed the handprint immediately. It was a Tuesday morning in late September when I first saw it. I arrived at my usual time, switched on the lights, and began my morning cleaning routine. As I wiped down the mirror with disinfectant, I noticed a single handprint pressed against the glass, positioned about chest high on the left side. The print was clear and detailed. I could see the whorls of fingerprints, the lines of the palm, even the slight smudge where the pinky finger had pressed against the surface. My first thought was that one of the evening staff had touched the mirror, perhaps steadying themselves while moving equipment. But the print was positioned oddly, as if someone had been standing behind the mirror and pressing outward from the inside. The angle was wrong for someone standing in my workspace to have made that mark. I cleaned it thoroughly and thought nothing more of it. But the next morning, it was back. Same position, same clarity, same impossible angle. This time I examined it more carefully, noting the size and shape. It was a woman's hand, I thought, or perhaps a teenager's smaller than my own, with slender fingers and a delicate palm. The print was so clear I could have used it for identification purposes, every ridge and line perfectly preserved in what looked like condensation on the glass. I cleaned it again, this time using ammonia-based cleaner and paper towels, scrubbing until the mirror gleamed. I even checked the back of the mirror, wondering if moisture was somehow seeping through from behind. But the wall was dry and the mirror was mounted securely. Wednesday morning brought the same handprint in the same position. Thursday, Friday, the following Monday, every morning, without fail, I found that single print waiting for me. I began arriving earlier, hoping to catch whoever was responsible, but the funeral home was always empty when I arrived. Mr. Henley didn't come in until 9, and the evening staff left by 6 p.m. The building was locked and alarmed overnight. After 2 weeks of this, I mentioned it to Mr. Henley during our morning briefing. He frowned and suggested that perhaps the cleaning crew was accidentally touching the mirror during their nightly rounds. But when I called the cleaning service, they insisted their staff had strict instructions not to touch any surfaces in the embalming room. They cleaned only the hallways and offices upstairs. I decided to replace the mirror entirely. Mr. Henley approved the expense, and I installed a new one myself, identical to the original, but fresh from the manufacturer. I cleaned it thoroughly before leaving that evening, ensuring no fingerprints or smudges remained. The handprint was there the next morning. This time, I photographed it with my phone, documenting the size and position. I measured it carefully. The palm was 4 inches from wrist to fingertip. The width, just under 3 inches. Definitely smaller than an adult hand, but not child-sized either. Something in between, like a young teenager or a small woman. Over the following weeks, I became obsessed with that handprint. I tried everything covering the mirror with plastic overnight, setting up a small camera to record the room, even sleeping in the funeral home one night to see if I could catch whoever was responsible. Nothing worked. The print appeared without fail every morning, and my camera recorded only empty hours of darkness. But I began to notice something else. The handprint was getting smaller. It was subtle at first, a millimeter here and there, but by the end of October I was certain. I had been measuring and photographing it daily, and the progression was undeniable. The palm was shrinking, the fingers getting shorter and thinner. What had started as a teenager's hand was becoming that of a child. I mentioned this to Dr. Reynolds, the pathologist who worked with our funeral home. She listened with professional interest, but suggested I might be experiencing stress-related hallucinations. She recommended I take some time off, see a counselor, maybe get a prescription for anxiety medication, but I knew what I was seeing was real. The photographs proved it. By November, the handprint was clearly that of a young child, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The palm was less than 3 inches long, the fingers delicate and small. I found myself standing in front of that mirror for long minutes each morning, staring at the impossible print, wondering who was reaching out from behind the glass. That's when I started thinking about the cases I had handled over the past months. Not the adults, they were routine, expected, part of the natural order of things. But there had been 3 children since the handprints began. A 6-year-old girl who had died in a car accident, a 9-year-old boy who had lost his battle with leukemia, and most recently, a 4-year-old girl who had drowned in a backyard pool. The handprint was now the size of a 4-year-old's hand. I spent a sleepless night researching the history of the building, wondering if some tragedy had occurred in my workspace. The funeral home had been built in 1973, replacing an older building that had housed a medical clinic. Before that, the lot had been empty. Nothing in the records suggested any reason for a child's spirit to be trapped in that basement room. But the handprint continued to shrink. By December, it was tiny, the size of a toddler's hand, maybe 2 years old. The fingerprints were still clear, still perfectly preserved in what looked like condensation. But now the hand was so small it seemed impossible that it could belong to anything human. I found myself talking to the mirror, asking questions that were never answered, pleading with whoever was there to tell me what they needed. On December 15th, I arrived to find the handprint had changed position. Instead of being pressed against the left side of the mirror, it was now in the center, directly above where I positioned each body for preparation. The hand was so small, no infant-sized, with tiny fingers and a palm no bigger than a silver dollar. I realized with growing horror that the handprint was following a pattern. Each time I prepared a child's body, the handprint shrank to match. It was as if someone was trying to communicate, to tell me something about the children who had passed through my care. But what and why? That afternoon, I was preparing the body of a 3-month-old baby who had died of SIDS. As I worked, I kept glancing at the mirror, watching my reflection as I performed the careful, gentle procedures required for such a small case. The work was always harder with children, the emotional weight of a life cut short, the grief of parents who would never see their child grow up. As I lifted the baby to position her properly, I caught a glimpse of movement in the mirror. For just a moment, I saw another reflection standing behind me, a small figure, translucent and wavering, with dark hair and solemn eyes. A child, maybe 5 or 6 years old, watching me work with an expression of profound sadness. I spun around, but the room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, only my own reflection stared back, pale and shaken, but I knew what I had seen. Someone was there, had always been there, watching me care for the children who would never grow up. The next morning, the handprint was gone. The mirror was clean, unmarked, reflecting only the sterile white of the embalming room. But I knew it would be back, probably smaller, probably in a different position. Because somewhere in that reflection, a child was still reaching out, still trying to tell me something I wasn't yet ready to understand. I still work in that room, still see my reflection in that mirror every day. The handprint appears sporadically now, sometimes large, sometimes small, always positioned with deliberate care. I've stopped trying to clean it away. Some things, I've learned, can't be washed clean. They leave marks that go deeper than glass and silver, marks that remind us we're not alone in our work with the dead. Sometimes, late in the afternoon when the light slants through the basement windows, I think I can see her more clearly, the child in the mirror, watching over the little ones who pass through my care. I don't know who she is or why she's there, but I've come to think of her as a guardian of sorts, making sure that even in death, no child is truly alone. The earth remembers what we try to forget. I'm Raymond Kowalski, and I've been working as head groundskeeper at Maplewood Cemetery for 26 years. In that time, I've dug more graves than I care to count, maintained every inch of these 93 acres, and learned to read the land like other people read books. Soil has its own language, the way it crumbles, the color when it's turned, the smell of different seasons settling into the ground. After all these years, I know when something's not right. Maplewood is one of the older cemeteries in the county, established in 1897 when the town was just a collection of farms and a single main street. The newer sections have modern amenities-paved roads, sprinkler systems, concrete vaults, but the older areas still require hand maintenance. It's honest work, quiet work, and I've always found peace in keeping the grounds respectful for families who come to remember their loved ones. My day starts at 6 a.m., checking the equipment shed and reviewing any scheduled burials or maintenance requests. Most of my crew arrives by 7 good men who understand that cemetery work requires a certain reverence. We're not just landscapers, we're caretakers of memory. Every headstone cleaned, every flower bed tended, every grave properly maintained is a small act of respect for those who can no longer care for themselves. The administrative office handles the paperwork, burial permits, plot sales, maintenance schedules, but the physical work falls to my crew. We dig by hand when machinery can't reach a site, repair irrigation lines that run beneath headstones, and occasionally exhume remains when families need to relocate. It's all routine, documented work that follows strict county regulations and cemetery policies. Plot 19-C sits in the middle section of the cemetery, about 50 yards from the main road and bordered by mature oak trees that have been there longer than the graves beneath them. According to the burial records, it's the final resting place of Harold Merchant, a 78-year-old man who died of heart failure in March of 2023. No surviving family, no regular visitors, just a simple granite headstone with his name and dates. The first time I was asked to dig there was in early April, just 3 weeks after Mr. Merchant's burial. The city water department needed to repair a main line that ran near the cemetery's eastern border, and their survey showed the line passed within 2 feet of plot 19-C. Standard procedure required us to excavate carefully around the grave to avoid disturbing the burial site while giving them access to the pipe. I remember the morning clearly because the weather was unseasonably warm for April, and I'd planned to start early before the heat made the work more difficult. But when I sank my shovel into the soil beside Mr. Merchant's grave, something felt wrong. The dirt was warm, not sun-warmed, which would have been impossible at 7 a.m., but warm from underneath, as if heated by some source below ground. At first, I thought it might be a broken water line creating the temperature difference, but as I dug deeper, the warmth increased rather than decreased. By the time I reached 4 feet, the standard depth for utility clearance, the soil was so warm I could feel it through my work gloves. That's when my shovel struck something hard. I cleared the dirt carefully, expecting to find a rock or piece of concrete. Instead, I uncovered a small red fire truck, the kind of die-cast toy that kids play with in sandboxes. It was in perfect condition, no rust or weather damage, as if it had been buried yesterday rather than sitting underground for months or years. I reported the find to the cemetery office, thinking perhaps the toy had been a burial item, something Mr. Merchant had been buried with for sentimental reasons. But Mrs. Holloway, the office manager, checked the burial records and found no mention of personal items. She suggested it might have been left by a child visiting another grave and somehow gotten covered by soil during routine maintenance. The water department completed their work without incident, and I backfilled the excavation, but the warmth in the soil bothered me. Even after replacing all the dirt and reseeding the grass, that section of ground felt different under my feet, softer, more yielding, like it was still settling. 6 weeks later, I got another work order for plot 19-C. This time, the electric company needed to install new junction boxes for the cemetery's lighting system, and their engineer claimed the optimal placement was directly adjacent to Mr. Merchant's grave. I questioned the location. There were plenty of other sites that would work just as well, but the paperwork was official, stamped with all the right signatures. The moment I began digging, I felt that same unnatural warmth. This time, I paid closer attention to the sensation. The heat seemed to radiate upward from deep in the ground, as if something far below was generating warmth. At exactly 4 feet down, my shovel again struck something hard. This time, it was a small wooden horse, hand-carved and painted with bright colors. Like the fire truck, it showed no signs of age or weather damage. The wood was smooth and warm to the touch, and there were small details of flowing mane, tiny, painted saddle that suggested it had been made with care, perhaps by someone who loved the child it was intended for. I called Mrs. Holloway immediately. She drove out to examine the toy herself, turning it over in her hands with a puzzled expression. "Raymond," she said, "this doesn't make sense." Harold Merchant had no children, no grandchildren. He lived alone for the last 20 years of his life. There's no reason for children's toys to be buried here. She promised to research the plot's history, to check if children had been buried there before Mr. Merchant. But when she called me the next day, her voice was troubled. Plot 19-C has never been used for a child's burial, she said. The records go back to the cemetery's founding. Harold Merchant was the first and only person interred there. Despite the mystery, we completed the electrical work and backfilled the site. But I found myself walking past Plot 19-C more often than necessary, drawn by a feeling I couldn't name. The grass grew back quickly, too quickly. In fact, as if the soil itself was eager to hide whatever lay beneath. The third work order came in late June. This time, it was the cemetery's own surveyor claiming there had been an error in the plot boundaries. He needed to re-establish the exact corners of Plot 19-C to resolve a property line dispute with the adjacent burial sites. It seemed like bureaucratic nonsense to me, but I had my orders. By now, I was expecting the warmth, and I wasn't disappointed. If anything, the soil felt even hotter than before, warm enough that steam seemed to rise from the freshly turned earth despite the cool morning air. At 4 feet down, my shovel struck not one but 3 objects: a small teddy bear, a set of building blocks, and a ceramic doll with painted blue eyes. All 3 toys were in pristine condition. The teddy bear's fur was soft and clean, the building blocks showed no chips or scratches, and the doll's dress looked like it had been sewn yesterday. But what disturbed me most was their arrangement. They weren't scattered randomly through the soil. They had been placed deliberately, carefully, as if someone had laid them out with purpose. I sat back on my heels, staring at the toys arranged in the bottom of the hole. The rational part of my mind searched for explanations. Maybe children had been playing in the cemetery and buried their toys as a game. Maybe someone was using the site as a hiding place. Maybe there was a logical reason for warm soil and perfectly preserved playthings buried exactly 4 feet down. But as I knelt there in the warm earth, surrounded by toys that shouldn't exist, I began to understand that some questions don't have rational answers. The soil beneath Plot 19-C was trying to tell me something, and with each excavation, the message was becoming clearer. I filled out my work report that evening, documenting the surveying completion and the discovery of additional toys. But I didn't mention the warmth in the soil, or the perfect condition of items that should have shown signs of burial. Some details seemed too strange to commit to official records. Mrs. Holloway called me into her office the next morning. She had been researching not just the cemetery records, but the history of the land itself. What she found changed everything I thought I understood about Plot 19-C. "Raymond," she said, spreading old maps across her desk, "before this was a cemetery, before any of these plots existed, this land was something else." She pointed to a faded survey from 1886. "Right here, where Plot 19-C is now, there used to be a schoolhouse, a one-room building that served the farming families in this area." She pulled out a newspaper clipping from 1894, yellowed with age. "There was a fire," she continued. 7 children died. The schoolhouse burned down during the winter, and they couldn't get the children out in time." Her finger traced the headline, "Tragic Fire Claims Young Lives at Rural School." I stared at the article, reading the names of the children who had died. Emma, age 6, Thomas, age 8, Sarah, age 5, 4 others, all between the ages of 4 and 9. All buried in the town cemetery that was later relocated when Maplewood was established. "But here's the thing, Raymond," Mrs. Holloway said quietly. "When they moved the town cemetery, they moved the headstones and the official burial sites. But there's no record of them actually moving the children's remains. The fire had damaged the bodies so severely that identification was difficult, and in those days, record-keeping wasn't as precise as it is now." She showed me one final document, a work order from 1897, when Maplewood Cemetery was first being established. They built right over the old schoolhouse site. Plot 19-C sits exactly where those children died. That afternoon, I walked out to Plot 19-C with a different understanding. The warmth in the soil wasn't coming from broken pipes or electrical systems. It was coming from 7 children who had died in flames over 100 years ago. Children whose remains had never been properly relocated, never been given the respect they deserved. I knelt beside Harold Merchant's headstone and placed my hand on the ground. The earth was warm, welcoming, alive with presence. Somewhere beneath my feet, 7 children were still waiting, still playing, still hoping someone would remember their names. I never told Mrs. Holloway about the feeling I had that day, or about the decision I made. But the next morning, I brought a small bouquet of wildflowers to plot 19-C. I placed them beside Mr. Merchant's headstone, but I spoke to the children below. "Emma," I said quietly, "Thomas, Sarah." I named them all, every child who had died in that schoolhouse fire. I remember you now. The ground beneath my feet felt warm and peaceful, and for the first time since I'd started digging at plot 19-C, the earth seemed satisfied. Some secrets need to be uncovered. Some memories need to be honored. And sometimes, the dead are just waiting for someone to acknowledge that they were here, that they mattered, that they are not forgotten. I still tend that plot with special care, and I always bring fresh flowers on the anniversary of the fire. The soil stays warm, but it feels different now, not desperate or demanding, but grateful. 7 children rest there alongside Harold Merchant, and finally, they are no longer alone. Some conversations should end with death, but grief has a way of keeping the line open. I'm Elena Vasquez, and I've been the managing director at Peaceful Rest Funeral Home for 11 years. It's a family business that's been serving our community since 1952, when my grandfather first opened the doors with nothing but a desire to help families through their darkest hours. We handle everything from initial arrangements to final services, providing dignity and comfort when people need it most. The funeral home operates 24 hours a day because death doesn't keep business hours. During the day, we meet with families, coordinate with clergy and cemetery staff, and prepare for services. But the evening and overnight hours are when much of the behind-the-scenes work happens: embalming, preparation, the quiet tasks that families don't need to see but that ensure their loved ones are treated with proper respect. My office is on the 2nd floor, overlooking the main chapel and visitation rooms. I typically stay late to handle paperwork, review the next day's schedule, and ensure everything is ready for morning services. The building settles differently at night. The old hardwood floors creak in a predictable rhythm, the heating system cycles with mechanical precision, and the phones ring less frequently. It's during these quiet hours that I can focus on the administrative details that keep the business running smoothly. We have 3 phone lines: the main number that families call for arrangements, a direct line to my office, and an emergency line for after-hours needs. All calls are logged automatically by our phone system, which tracks incoming and outgoing calls, duration, and the specific line used. It's helpful for billing purposes and ensures we can follow up with families who might need additional services. The first unusual call complaint came from the Morrison family in late August. Mrs. Morrison had lost her husband of 43 years to a sudden heart attack, and we had conducted the funeral service 2 weeks earlier. She appeared at my office on a Tuesday afternoon, visibly shaken and clutching a crumpled tissue. "Mrs. Vasquez," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk, "I know this sounds crazy, but I think there's been some kind of mistake with your phone system." She explained that she had received a call the previous evening around 9 p.m. The caller ID showed our funeral home's main number, and when she answered, she heard her husband's voice. "He sounded exactly like Harold," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "He said my name the way he always did, with that little chuckle at the end. Then he said, 'Come back soon, Margaret. I'm waiting for you.' The line went dead after that." I assured Mrs. Morrison that we would investigate immediately. My first thought was that someone was playing a cruel prank, perhaps using voice recording technology to impersonate the deceased. But when I checked our phone logs for the previous evening, there was no record of any outgoing calls between 8 p.m. and midnight. Our system showed only 2 incoming calls during that period, both from families confirming morning service details. I explained this to Mrs. Morrison, suggesting that perhaps the caller ID had been spoofed by someone with malicious intent. She seemed somewhat relieved by this explanation, and I promised to contact the phone company about security measures. But something about her description bothered me. The specific phrase, "Come back soon," and the way she described her husband's distinctive chuckle. 2 weeks later, I received a similar complaint from the Chen family. Their teenage daughter had died in a car accident, and we had handled the funeral arrangements in early September. Mr. Chen called my direct line on a Friday afternoon, his voice tight with emotion. "Director Vasquez," he said, "my wife received a very disturbing call last night. The caller ID showed your number, and she heard our daughter's voice asking us to come back to the funeral home. She said, 'Come back soon, Mom. I miss you so much.' This has upset my wife terribly." Again, I checked the phone logs. No outgoing calls were recorded for the time Mr. Chen specified. I began to suspect we were dealing with a pattern of harassment, targeting grieving families, possibly someone with access to our client records and sophisticated voice manipulation technology. I contacted the police and our phone service provider, but neither could offer immediate solutions. The complaints continued over the following month. The Patterson family, who had lost their elderly father, the Rodriguez family, whose mother had passed after a long illness, the Williams family, whose young son had died suddenly from an undiagnosed heart condition. Each family reported receiving calls from their deceased loved ones, always with the same message, "Come back soon." All calls allegedly came from our main line. None were recorded in our phone system. I began staying later at the office, monitoring the phones personally during the evening hours when most of these calls were supposedly being made. I installed additional recording equipment and asked our answering service to log any unusual activity. But night after night, the phones remained silent during the reported call times. The breakthrough came in mid-October, during a particularly long evening when I was working on arrangements for 3 separate services scheduled for the following week. At exactly 9:47 p.m., I heard something that made me look up from my paperwork, the faint sound of a phone ringing somewhere in the building. It wasn't coming from my office or the main reception area. The sound was muffled, distant, as if it were ringing behind walls, or from a room I couldn't immediately identify. I followed the sound down the main staircase, through the chapel, and toward the preparation rooms in the basement level. The ringing was coming from the embalming suite, specifically from a small office adjacent to the main preparation room that we used for storage. But there was no phone in that room, I was certain of it. We had never installed a line there because it was used only for supplies and equipment storage. When I opened the door, the ringing stopped immediately. The room was exactly as it should be. Metal shelving units filled with supplies, a small desk we used for paperwork, and boxes of materials for funeral preparation. No phone, no electronic equipment that could have produced the sound I'd heard. But as I stood in the doorway, I noticed something else. The air in the room felt different, cooler than the rest of the basement, with a quality that reminded me of the moments just before a thunderstorm. And there was a presence, a sensation of being watched by someone I couldn't see. I returned to my office and immediately called the Morrison family. Mrs. Morrison answered on the first ring, and I could hear television background noise. "Mrs. Morrison, this is Elena Vasquez from the funeral home. Have you received any unusual calls this evening?" There was a pause, then her voice, confused and frightened. "Yes, actually. About 10 minutes ago, Harold called again. He said the same thing. 'Come back soon, Margaret.' How did you know?" 10 minutes earlier would have been exactly 9:47 p.m. the moment I had heard the phantom phone ringing in the storage room. Over the following weeks, I developed a routine. Whenever I heard the mysterious ringing from the basement, I would note the exact time and follow up with families who had recently used our services. The pattern was always the same. The ringing would stop when I approached the storage room, and within minutes, a grieving family member would receive a call from their deceased loved one. But it was more than just the timing that convinced me something supernatural was happening. The family's descriptions of the calls were too specific, too emotionally accurate to be the work of a prankster. Mrs. Morrison's husband really did have a distinctive chuckle. The Chen's daughter really did call her mother Mom in a particular affectionate way. The details were perfect because they were real. The most disturbing call came in late November, just before Thanksgiving. I was working alone in the building when I heard the ringing from the storage room. This time, instead of investigating immediately, I waited and listened. The ringing continued for several minutes, longer than usual, with a rhythm that seemed almost urgent. When I finally went downstairs, I found the storage room door standing open. I was certain I had closed it earlier that evening. It was a habit I'd developed to keep the room secure. But now it stood ajar, and the temperature inside felt even colder than before. As I reached to close the door, I heard something that stopped me cold. A voice, faint but unmistakable, coming from inside the empty room. It was speaking in a whisper, repeating the same phrase over and over. Come back soon, come back soon, come back soon. The voice wasn't coming from any electronic device. It seemed to rise from the air itself, as if the room had somehow become a conduit for words that needed to be spoken. I stood frozen in the doorway, listening to that endless, pleading repetition, until finally the voice faded into silence. My phone rang 30 seconds later. It was the Patterson family, calling to report that their father had just contacted them from beyond the grave. I've come to understand that the storage room serves as some kind of communication center for the deceased, a place where the boundary between life and death becomes permeable for brief moments. The phone system isn't malfunctioning. It's being used by forces that don't require physical equipment to make contact with the living. I still work late at the funeral home, still hear that phantom ringing from the basement, but now I don't investigate. I've learned that some conversations are meant to happen, even when they shouldn't be possible. The dead have their own reasons for reaching out, their own need to maintain connection with those they've left behind. The families still receive their calls, and I still have no outgoing records to show for them, but I've stopped trying to explain the impossible. Sometimes, love finds a way to transcend death, and sometimes, the only thing the dead want is to remind us that they haven't really gone away. When I lock up the building each night, I can still hear that faint ringing from the storage room, and I know that somewhere, someone who has crossed over is making one last call to someone who isn't ready to say goodbye. In the morning, my phone will ring with another confused, frightened family asking about calls that shouldn't exist. And I'll listen with understanding, because I've learned that death doesn't always mean the conversation is over. Some passengers never reach their final destination, and some destinations choose their own passengers. I'm Carl Morrison, and I've been driving for Whitmore Funeral Services for 15 years. It's not the kind of job most people think about, but someone has to transport the deceased from funeral homes to their final resting places with dignity and respect. My route covers 6 counties and 14 different cemeteries, from small family plots to large memorial parks. I know every road, every entrance, every groundskeeper by name. The work requires precision and attention to detail. Each transport must be documented pickup time, destination, mileage, any special instructions from the family or funeral director. I maintain detailed logs that track every aspect of my daily runs, from fuel consumption to maintenance schedules. The state requires these records for licensing purposes, and families deserve to know their loved ones were transported with proper care and professionalism. My day typically starts at 7 a.m. at the Whitmore facility, where I review the transport schedule with Mrs. Whitmore and perform a thorough inspection of the hearse. The vehicle is a 2019 Cadillac XTS, specially modified for funeral transport with a professional cargo area and climate control systems. I check the mechanical systems, clean the interior and exterior, and ensure all equipment is properly secured before beginning my routes. The hearse is equipped with a GPS system that automatically logs mileage and travel times, though I also maintain handwritten records as backup. Each transport requires a signed manifest that documents pickup and delivery details, passenger information, and any special handling requirements. At the end of each day, I reconcile my handwritten logs with the electronic systems and file reports with the main office. Most of my regular routes are familiar territory. The drive to Maplewood Cemetery takes 32 minutes, Green Hill Memorial is 45 minutes on back roads, and St. Joseph's Catholic Cemetery requires an hour round trip through rural counties. I've made these drives thousands of times over the years, and I know the mileage within a few tenths of a mile for each destination. The discrepancies started appearing in my logs about 3 weeks ago. Small differences at first, an extra mile here and there. Minor variations in travel time that I attributed to traffic or road construction. But when I compared my handwritten records with the electronic logs, the numbers didn't match. According to the GPS system, I was driving longer distances and visiting locations that weren't on my scheduled route. The first major discrepancy occurred on a Tuesday in late October. My schedule showed 3 transports, 2 to Maplewood Cemetery and 1 to Green Hill Memorial. According to my handwritten log, I completed all 3 runs without incident, finishing my day at approximately 4:30 p.m. with a total mileage of 87 miles. But when I checked the electronic logs the next morning, the system showed I had driven 112 miles and made 5 separate trips to 4 different cemeteries. The GPS indicated I had visited Maplewood twice, Green Hill once, and 2 additional locations I had never heard of: Willowbrook Cemetery and Sacred Heart Memorial Gardens. I assumed there was a malfunction in the GPS system and reported it to our maintenance contractor. They ran diagnostic tests and found no problems with the hardware or software. The system was functioning perfectly, accurately recording every mile driven and every destination reached. That's when I started paying closer attention to my transport manifest. Each trip requires a signed document that lists the deceased person's name, pickup location, destination, and delivery confirmation. The manifests are carbon copy forms that create automatic duplicates for our records. I had been filing these routinely for years without really scrutinizing the details. When I reviewed the previous week's manifests, I found 7 completed transport forms in my file, but I could only remember handling 5 bodies. 2 of the manifests showed deliveries to the mysterious cemeteries that appeared in my GPS logs: Willowbrook and Sacred Heart, 4 passengers whose names I didn't recognize and couldn't remember transporting. The manifests were in my handwriting, signed with my usual signature, and properly filled out with all required information, but I had no memory of writing them or making those deliveries. According to the paperwork, I had transported an elderly woman named Dorothy Fleming to Willowbrook Cemetery and a middle-aged man named Robert Nash to Sacred Heart Memorial Gardens. I called Mrs. Whitmore to discuss the discrepancies, thinking perhaps other drivers had been using my hearse or there had been some administrative error in the record keeping. But she confirmed that I was the only driver assigned to my vehicle, and she had no knowledge of any Dorothy Fleming or Robert Nash in our recent client files. "Carl," she said over the phone, "are you feeling all right? You've seemed distracted lately, maybe a little forgetful. This is a stressful job, and it affects everyone differently." I assured her I was fine, but privately, I began to worry about my mental state. Was I developing early-stage dementia? Had the years of transporting the deceased finally taken a psychological toll that was causing memory lapses? I made an appointment with my doctor for a complete physical and cognitive evaluation. The tests came back normal. No signs of neurological problems, no indication of memory disorders or cognitive decline. Dr. Harrison suggested that stress might be causing mild dissociative episodes, but he found no medical explanation for my inability to remember specific work activities. Meanwhile, the discrepancies in my logs continued. Each week brought new entries for cemeteries I had never visited and passengers I couldn't remember transporting. The electronic systems consistently showed longer drives and additional stops that didn't match my conscious memory of the workday. I decided to research the mysterious cemeteries that kept appearing in my GPS logs. Willowbrook Cemetery turned out to be a small, privately owned burial ground about 60 miles from our facility, located in a rural area I had never consciously visited. Sacred Heart Memorial Gardens was even more remote, situated in the mountains nearly 90 miles away on winding back roads. Both cemeteries were legitimate businesses with proper state licensing and decades of operational history. When I called their offices, the staff confirmed that they had recently received deliveries from Whitmore Funeral Services. They had documentation showing that I had personally signed their delivery receipts and followed all proper protocols for the transfers. "You were very professional, Mr. Morrison," the groundskeeper at Willowbrook told me. "Arrived right on schedule, handled the transfer with appropriate respect. You mentioned that you'd been driving that route for years, said you knew the road like the back of your hand. But I had never been to Willowbrook Cemetery. I had never driven those rural roads or met that groundskeeper. Yet according to multiple sources, GPS logs, written manifests, delivery receipts, and eyewitness accounts, I had been making regular trips to these remote locations while having no conscious memory of the experiences. The breakthrough came on a Thursday morning when I decided to install a dashboard camera in the hearse to monitor my own behavior during transport runs. If I was experiencing some kind of dissociative episodes, perhaps video evidence would help me understand what was happening during the memory gaps. The camera recorded my entire workday, capturing every moment from the time I left the funeral home until I returned in the evening. At the end of the day, I had clear video documentation of 3 scheduled transports to familiar cemeteries. But when I checked my logs, the paperwork showed 5 trips, including deliveries to 2 remote locations that weren't captured on camera. The most disturbing discovery was that the camera showed me returning to the funeral home and parking the hearse at approximately 4:15 p.m. But the GPS log indicated that I had continued driving until nearly 7 p.m., making 2 additional trips to cemeteries over 100 miles away. I watched the video footage carefully, looking for any sign that I had left the facility after parking. The camera showed me completing my end-of-day routine, filing paperwork, and locking up the hearse. There was no evidence that I had driven anywhere after 4:15 p.m. Yet the electronic logs, the written manifests, and the delivery receipts all indicated that I had continued working for nearly 3 more hours, transporting passengers to destinations I had never consciously visited. That night, I made a decision that I knew would sound crazy to anyone I tried to explain it to. I installed additional cameras, both inside and outside the hearse, positioned to capture any movement or activity that might occur after hours. If something was using my vehicle for unauthorized transports, I was determined to document it. The footage from that night revealed something that challenged everything I thought I understood about reality. At exactly 11:47 p.m., the interior camera showed the hearse starting itself and beginning to drive along dark, unfamiliar roads. The driver's seat remained empty, but the vehicle moved with purposeful navigation, as if guided by an invisible hand. I watched in fascination and terror as my hearse drove itself through the night, following routes I had never taken to cemeteries I had never visited. The dashboard instruments operated normally. The GPS system tracked the journey accurately, and at each destination, the cargo area opened to allow passengers to complete their final journey to graves that had been waiting for them. At dawn, the hearse returned to the funeral home parking lot and shut itself off, leaving no evidence of its nocturnal travels, except for the documentation that would later appear in my logs. The camera captured everything: the impossible journey, the self-operating vehicle, the supernatural passengers who somehow managed to sign manifests and complete their own transfers to final resting places. I have continued working at Whitmore Funeral Services, but I no longer question the discrepancies in my transport logs. Some passengers have been waiting so long for their final journey that they've learned to arrange their own transportation. My hearse has become a vehicle for souls who never made it to their intended destinations, and I've become the unconscious facilitator of their supernatural transit system. The electronic logs continue to show trips I don't remember taking, and the manifests continue to document passengers I never consciously transported. But now I understand that my job extends beyond the living world's definition of funeral services. I'm not just a hearse driver. I'm a conductor on a transit system that operates between worlds, ensuring that everyone eventually reaches their final destination. Each morning, I review the previous night's logs with a mixture of professional curiosity and supernatural acceptance. Somewhere in the darkness, my hearse is completing journeys that began decades ago, carrying passengers who refuse to let death be the end of their travel plans. And I've learned that some routes can't be found on any map. They exist only in the space between what we remember and what we need to forget. Some messages are written in petals instead of ink. I'm Lucy Chen, and I've been working maintenance at Restwood Cemetery for 9 years. It's honest work that keeps me outdoors and gives me a sense of purpose, maintaining the dignity of final resting places for families who trust us with their most precious memories. The grounds span 67 acres of rolling hills, dotted with oak trees and marble monuments. And every morning I walk the same routes, checking for damage, cleaning headstones, and tending to the flower arrangements that families leave for their loved ones. My shift starts at 6 a.m., when the morning dew still clings to the grass, and the cemetery feels peaceful in that particular way that only comes with dawn. I drive the maintenance cart along the paved paths, stopping to collect wilted flowers, straighten knocked-over arrangements, and note any repairs needed for headstones or fencing. It's methodical work that requires attention to detail. Families notice when their loved one's grave isn't properly cared for, and we take that responsibility seriously. The cemetery operates under strict guidelines about decorations and flowers. Fresh arrangements are welcome, but they must be removed once they begin to wilt. Artificial flowers are allowed only during winter months, when fresh blooms won't survive the weather. We maintain a greenhouse on the property where we grow seasonal flowers for families who want fresh arrangements but can't visit regularly. Everything is documented in our maintenance logs to ensure consistent care. Mrs. Patterson's grave sits in Section B, about halfway up the main hill under a cluster of mature dogwood trees. According to the burial records, she was 93 when she passed away in July, survived by 2 adult children who live out of state. The headstone is simple gray granite with her name, dates, and the inscription, "Beloved Mother and Grandmother." A small concrete vase sits beside the headstone, and family members regularly fill it with fresh roses, always red roses, usually a dozen at a time. I first noticed something unusual about Mrs. Patterson's grave on a Tuesday morning in early September. The roses in her vase had been arranged in an odd pattern, forming what looked almost like letters spread across the grass around the headstone. At first glance, I thought wind or animals had scattered the flowers, but when I looked more closely, the arrangement seemed too deliberate to be accidental. The roses were positioned to spell he, with the stems and blooms carefully placed to form clear letter shapes. It was subtle. You had to look at it from the right angle to see the pattern, but once I noticed it, the letters were unmistakable. I assumed one of Mrs. Patterson's grandchildren had been playing while the family visited, using the flowers to practice spelling or leave a message for their grandmother. I gathered the roses and placed them back in the vase, making a note in my log about the scattered arrangement. But the next morning, they were arranged again, this time spelling LP in the same deliberate pattern. The roses hadn't just fallen out of the vase, they had been placed with careful precision, each bloom positioned exactly where it needed to be to form readable letters. I began paying closer attention to Mrs. Patterson's grave during my morning rounds. Over the following week, I found the roses arranged to spell partial words, hell, sore, way, and once, very clearly, help. Each morning brought a new arrangement, always using the same dozen red roses, always positioned with the same careful precision. At first, I suspected vandalism. Perhaps teenagers were sneaking into the cemetery at night, rearranging the flowers as some kind of prank. But the arrangements weren't destructive or disrespectful. If anything, they seemed like attempts at communication. The roses were never damaged, just repositioned, and they were always replaced in the vase before dawn so families wouldn't see the disturbance. I decided to stay late one evening to observe Mrs. Patterson's grave directly. I parked my maintenance cart about 50 yards away, behind a large monument where I could watch without being seen. From 6 p.m. until nearly midnight, nothing happened. The roses remained in their vase, undisturbed by wind or wildlife. No teenagers appeared to rearrange them. The cemetery was completely silent, except for the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. I gave up my vigil around midnight, convinced that my presence was somehow preventing whatever force was responsible for the arrangements. But the next morning, the roses spelled sorry in clear, deliberate letters across the grass. That's when I decided to check the security footage. Restwood has cameras positioned throughout the grounds to deter vandalism and theft, including one that covers Section B, where Mrs. Patterson is buried. I asked Dave, our security coordinator, to review the overnight footage from the past week, specifically focusing on the area around Mrs. Patterson's grave. What we found on the recordings defied explanation. Between 2 and 3 a.m. each night, the security camera captured the roses moving on their own, not falling or being blown by wind, but moving with purposeful, rapid motions. The flowers would lift themselves out of the vase and arrange themselves on the ground in the letter patterns I had been finding each morning. The movement was so fast it appeared almost frantic, as if whoever was controlling the roses had limited time to complete their message. Individual blooms would dart across the grass, stems would twist and position themselves with mechanical precision, and within minutes, the arrangement would be complete. At exactly 3 a.m., the flowers would return to the vase as quickly as they had left it. Dave and I watched the footage in stunned silence. The camera was working perfectly. We could see every detail of the roses' movement, the way they seemed to know exactly where to position themselves, the deliberate intelligence behind each arrangement. But there was no visible force causing the movement. The flowers simply moved on their own. "Lucy," Dave said quietly, "in 20 years of security work, I've never seen anything like this. These roses are trying to tell us something." I began researching Mrs. Patterson's background, wondering if there was something in her history that might explain the flower arrangements. According to the funeral home records, she had lived in the same house for 62 years, raised 4 children, and worked as a school secretary until her retirement in 1995. Nothing in her obituary suggested any unusual circumstances surrounding her death or burial. But when I contacted her daughter, Maria, to ask about the roses, she provided information that changed everything I thought I understood about Mrs. Patterson's grave. "Those red roses were Mom's favorite," Maria explained over the phone. "She grew them in her backyard for decades. But the strangest thing is, we've never brought roses to her grave. We've been leaving white lilies. They were easier to find, and we thought she'd understand. I have no idea where those red roses are coming from." I felt a chill run down my spine. For weeks, I had been assuming that family members were leaving the roses that were being rearranged each night. But according to her daughter, no one had been bringing red roses to Mrs. Patterson's grave. The flowers were appearing on their own. That evening, I returned to the cemetery with a new understanding of what I was witnessing. I positioned myself near Mrs. Patterson's grave just before 2 a.m., determined to see the flower arrangement happen in person rather than just on security footage. At exactly 2:07 a.m., I watched 12 red roses materialize in the concrete vase beside Mrs. Patterson's headstone. They didn't fall from the sky or grow from the ground, they simply appeared, as if someone invisible had placed them there with careful attention to their positioning and freshness. Then, at 2:33 a.m., the arrangement began. I watched in fascination and terror as the roses lifted themselves from the vase and began moving across the grass with purposeful, rapid motions. Each flower seemed to know exactly where it needed to go, darting and positioning itself with the precision of someone spelling out an urgent message. Within minutes, the roses had formed letters that spelled "Forgive me" in clear, unmistakable script across the ground in front of the headstone. But it was what happened next that truly unsettled me. As I stood watching the completed arrangement, I saw a translucent figure kneeling beside the rosacea woman in her 70s with gray hair and kind eyes, wearing a floral dress that seemed to shimmer in the moonlight. She was tending to the roses with gentle, loving care, adjusting their positions slightly and whispering words I couldn't quite hear. The woman looked up at me with an expression of profound sadness and relief, as if she had been waiting years for someone to finally witness her nightly ritual. Her lips moved silently, and though I couldn't hear her voice, I somehow understood what she was trying to communicate. She was sorry for something, asking for forgiveness, trying to make amends for a mistake that had haunted her even beyond death. At exactly 3 a.m., the figure faded away, and the roses returned to their vase with the same rapid, purposeful movement I had observed on the security footage. The grass showed no evidence of the arrangement that had just been there, and the cemetery returned to its natural silence. I returned to Mrs. Patterson's grave the next morning and found the roses arranged to spell "Thank you" in neat, grateful letters across the grass. It was the last time I found them arranged in any pattern. Since that night, the red roses appear each morning in their vase, fresh and beautiful, but they remain undisturbed. I never learned what Mrs. Patterson was seeking forgiveness for, or why she needed someone to witness her nightly messages before she could find peace. But I continue to tend her grave with special care, ensuring that the mysterious red roses are always properly maintained and that her final resting place reflects the dignity she deserves. Sometimes, when I'm working near Section B in the early morning hours, I catch a glimpse of movement near Mrs. Blank Patterson's headstone figure kneeling among the flowers, tending to her eternal garden with the same loving attention she must have given to her backyard roses when she was alive. I don't approach or try to communicate. Some conversations are meant to be private, even when they happen between the living and the dead. The roses still appear each morning, and I still document them in my maintenance log as fresh flowers, family arrangement, because in the end, that's exactly what the area family members' way of saying goodbye, one petal at a time. Some people never learn to say goodbye, even when they've run out of time to practice. I'm Derek Walsh, and I've been working as a funeral assistant at Mercy Rest Funeral Home for 7 years. It's detail-oriented work that requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity, helping families through their darkest hours, while ensuring every aspect of their loved one's final service meets the highest standards of dignity and respect. The funeral home has been serving our community since 1948, and we take pride in maintaining traditions that bring comfort to grieving families. My responsibilities include preparing viewing rooms for services, coordinating with families and clergy, and ensuring all equipment and facilities are properly maintained. I typically work the evening shift from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., which covers most visitation hours and allows me to reset rooms for the following day's services. The building is a restored Victorian mansion with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and stained glass windows that create a peaceful atmosphere for families to gather and remember their loved ones. The main viewing room, called the Serenity Chapel, can accommodate up to 60 people for larger services. It features antique furniture, soft lighting, and a raised area where caskets are positioned for viewing. The room has excellent acoustics designed so that even whispered conversations can be heard clearly throughout the space, which helps create an intimate atmosphere for family gatherings and memorial services. Each evening, after the last families have departed, I perform a thorough cleaning and preparation routine. I arrange flowers, adjust lighting, vacuum carpets, and ensure chairs are properly positioned for the next day's services. The work is methodical and peaceful, and I've always found satisfaction in creating beautiful, respectful spaces for families to say their final farewells. The first time I encountered one of the evening visitors was on a Tuesday night in early November. I was finishing the cleanup in the Serenity Chapel after a long day of visitation for Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who had passed away after a brief illness. The family had taken the floral arrangements and personal items, and I had just finished moving the casket to our preparation area for the next morning's funeral service. As I was adjusting the chairs for the following day's setup, I noticed an elderly woman sitting in the front row, facing the empty space where Mr. Henderson's casket had been positioned. She was well dressed in a navy blue suit with a small hat, clutching a handkerchief and speaking in low, comforting tones to the vacant area in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said gently, approaching her with the care I'd learned to use when dealing with confused or overwhelmed family members. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours ended at 9 p.m. The building is closed now." She turned to look at me with kind but puzzled eyes, as if she was trying to remember something important. "Oh, hello, dear," she said with a slight smile. "I was wondering when the service is going to start. I've been waiting quite a while, and I don't want to be late for Arthur's funeral." I checked our schedule on my clipboard. There was no Arthur listed for any of our current services, and Mr. Henderson's funeral was scheduled for the following morning. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there might be some confusion. Can I help you find the right location? Maybe call someone to pick you up? She looked back toward the empty viewing area with an expression of genuine concern. But Arthur is right there, she said, pointing to the space where no casket stood. He's been waiting so patiently, and I promised I'd be here for him. We've been friends for 63 years, you know. I can't let him down now. I followed her gaze but saw only the empty raised platform and flower stands that we used for casket placement. The woman seemed to be looking at something specific. Her eyes focused on a particular spot, as if she could see someone I couldn't. Her voice carried the tone people use when speaking directly to another person, not the distant quality of someone talking to empty air. "Ma'am, I'm going to call our director to help sort this out," I said. But when I turned back from reaching for the phone, she was gone. The front row was empty, and I could hear no footsteps or doors closing. The building was completely silent except for the gentle hum of the heating system. I searched the entire building, every viewing room, hallway, office, and exit, but found no trace of the elderly woman. All doors were locked from the inside, and our security system showed no record of anyone entering or leaving after normal hours. I checked with our director the next morning, but she had no knowledge of any Arthur in our recent services, or any elderly woman who might have gotten confused about funeral arrangements. The second encounter happened 3 weeks later. I was preparing the Serenity Chapel for a morning service when I discovered an elderly man sitting in the third row, wearing a black suit that looked like it might have been fashionable several decades ago. He was speaking quietly, but animatedly, occasionally chuckling as if sharing memories with someone beside him, though the chair next to him was empty. "Sir," I said, approaching with the same gentle caution I'd used before, "I'm sorry, but the building is closed. Visiting hours don't start until tomorrow morning." He looked up with a warm, grandfatherly smile and tipped his hat slightly. "Oh, good evening, young man. I was just visiting with Helen here." He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "We were married for 47 years, you know. I promised her I'd never miss a chance to see her, and I always keep my promises." I glanced at our service schedule. We had no Helen listed for current or recent services. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion about the timing or location. Can I call someone to help you get where you need to be?" "Nonsense," he said with a pleasant laugh. "Helen's funeral is today. I've been looking forward to seeing all the family again, hearing the stories about her garden and her famous apple pies. She'd be so pleased to know how many people came to remember her." He turned back toward the empty chair and continued speaking, as if carrying on a conversation with someone who was responding to his comments. "Helen, dear, this nice young man is concerned about us. Should we tell him about the roses you planted behind the house? The ones that still bloom every spring?" I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he was waiting for responses that I couldn't hear, pausing at appropriate moments as if listening to replies from his deceased wife. His behavior wasn't the random rambling of dementia, it was the natural rhythm of two people who had spent decades finishing each other's sentences. When I returned with our director to help resolve the situation, the elderly man had vanished just as mysteriously as the woman before him. No signs of entry or exit, no explanation for how he had gotten into a locked building or where he had gone. Over the following months, I encountered similar visitors with increasing frequency. Always elderly, always well-dressed in clothing that seemed slightly out of date, always speaking to deceased loved ones as if they were present in the room. They would ask about funeral services for people who weren't on our schedule, mention details about lives and relationships that sounded authentic but couldn't be verified in our records. The pattern became clear. These weren't confused or disoriented people wandering into the wrong building. They were mourners who had somehow become disconnected from time, still attending funerals that had ended years or decades ago, still keeping vigil for people who had already been laid to rest. I began researching our funeral home's historical records, looking for names that matched the people my mysterious visitors claimed to be mourning. What I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Every name they mentioned, Arthur, Helen, and dozens of others appeared in our records from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. These elderly visitors weren't confused about current services. They were attending funerals that had taken place when they were younger, before age and time had taken their own toll. Somehow, they had become trapped in moments of grief so profound that they continued to replay them decades after the fact. The most disturbing encounter occurred on a December evening when I found the Serenity Chapel filled with nearly 30 elderly mourners, all sitting quietly and speaking in low voices to empty chairs and vacant spaces around the room. The scene looked like a normal funeral gathering, except that there was no casket, no flowers, and no actual people to mourn. As I stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was witnessing, one of the mournersa women in a vintage black dress with a pearl necklace sanitized me and approached with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, dear," she said with genuine kindness. "Are you here for Margaret's service?" "I'm her sister Rose, and I wanted to make sure you knew that the family is receiving visitors in the side room after the ceremony. Margaret would have been so pleased that you came to pay your respects." I looked around the room at the gathered mourners, all of them engaged in quiet conversations with people I couldn't see, all of them participating in a funeral service that existed only in their collective memory. The absence was so palpable it felt like presence as if the Serenity Chapel was hosting a gathering of spirits who had never learned to let go of their earthly connections. "When did Margaret pass away?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Oh, it was so sudden," Rose replied with genuine sadness. "Just last week. A heart attack in her sleep. She was only 67, you know. Far too young to leave us all behind." I checked our records the next morning and found Margaret's service listed in our files from 1972, over 50 years ago. Her sister Rose had been listed as one of the family members who had helped arrange the funeral, a young woman in her 30s who had died herself 15 years later. I continue working at Mercy Rest Funeral Home, but I've developed a different understanding of my role in the evening hours. The building serves not just the recently deceased and their immediate families, but also the generations of mourners who have passed through these rooms over the decades. Some grief is so profound that it transcends time, creating echoes that replay long after the original mourners have joined their loved ones. I no longer try to direct these evening visitors to exits or call for assistance. Instead, I quietly maintain the viewing rooms, ensuring they remain dignified spaces for whatever services are taking place, whether they're scheduled for tomorrow morning or whether they ended decades ago. Some people need more time to say goodbye than a single lifetime can provide, and I've learned that true hospitality means accommodating guests from any era who still need a place to gather and remember. Each evening, as I lock up the building, I can hear the soft murmur of conversations continuing in the Serenity Chapel voices, sharing memories, offering comfort, and maintaining the eternal bonds that death can interrupt but never truly break. In the morning, the rooms are always empty and properly arranged for the day's scheduled services, but the peace that lingers suggests that some farewells are worth repeating as many times as necessary. Some people never learn to say goodbye, even when they've run out of time to practice. I'm Derek Walsh, and I've been working as a funeral assistant at Mercy Rest Funeral Home for 7 years. It's detail-oriented work that requires both technical skill and emotional sensitivity, helping families through their darkest hours while ensuring every aspect of their loved one's final service meets the highest standards of dignity and respect. The funeral home has been serving our community since 1948, and we take pride in maintaining traditions that bring comfort to grieving families. My responsibilities include preparing viewing rooms for services, coordinating with families and clergy, and ensuring all equipment and facilities are properly maintained. I typically work the evening shift, from 3 p.m. to 11 p.m., which covers most visitation hours and allows me to reset rooms for the following day's services. The building is a restored Victorian mansion with high ceilings, hardwood floors, and stained glass windows that create a peaceful atmosphere for families to gather and remember their loved ones. The main viewing room, called the Serenity Chapel, can accommodate up to 60 people for larger services. It features antique furniture, soft lighting, and a raised area where caskets are positioned for viewing. The room has excellent acoustics designed so that even whispered conversations can be heard clearly throughout the space, which helps create an intimate atmosphere for family gatherings and memorial services. Each evening, after the last families have departed, I perform a thorough cleaning and preparation routine. I arrange flowers, adjust lighting, vacuum carpets, and ensure chairs are properly positioned for the next day's services. The work is methodical and peaceful, and I've always found satisfaction in creating beautiful, respectful spaces for families to say their final farewells. The first time I encountered one of the evening visitors was on a Tuesday night in early November. I was finishing the cleanup in the Serenity Chapel after a long day of visitation for Mr. Henderson, an elderly man who had passed away after a brief illness. The family had taken the floral arrangements and personal items, and I had just finished moving the casket to our preparation area for the next morning's funeral service. As I was adjusting the chairs for the following day's setup, I noticed an elderly woman sitting in the front row, facing the empty space where Mr. Henderson's casket had been positioned. She was well dressed in a navy blue suit with a small hat, clutching a handkerchief and speaking in low, comforting tones to the vacant area in front of her. "Excuse me, ma'am," I said gently, approaching her with the care I'd learned to use when dealing with confused or overwhelmed family members. "I'm sorry, but visiting hours ended at 9 p.m. The building is closed now." She turned to look at me with kind but puzzled eyes, as if she was trying to remember something important. "Oh, hello, dear," she said with a slight smile. "I was wondering when the service is going to start. I've been waiting quite a while, and I don't want to be late for Arthur's funeral." I checked our schedule on my clipboard. There was no Arthur listed for any of our current services, and Mr. Henderson's funeral was scheduled for the following morning. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there might be some confusion. Can I help you find the right location? Maybe call someone to pick you up?" She looked back toward the empty viewing area with an expression of genuine concern. "But Arthur is right there," she said, pointing to the space where no casket stood. "He's been waiting so patiently, and I promised I'd be here for him. We've been friends for 63 years, you know. I can't let him down now." I followed her gaze but saw only the empty raised platform and flower stands that we used for casket placement. The woman seemed to be looking at something specific. Her eyes focused on a particular spot, as if she could see someone I couldn't. Her voice carried the tone people use when speaking directly to another person, not the distant quality of someone talking to empty air. "Ma'am, I'm going to call our director to help sort this out," I said. But when I turned back from reaching for the phone, she was gone. The front row was empty, and I could hear no footsteps or doors closing. The building was completely silent, except for the gentle hum of the heating system. I searched the entire building, every viewing room, hallway, office, and exit, but found no trace of the elderly woman. All doors were locked from the inside, and our security system showed no record of anyone entering or leaving after normal hours. I checked with our director the next morning, but she had no knowledge of any Arthur in our recent services, or any elderly woman who might have gotten confused about funeral arrangements. The second encounter happened 3 weeks later. I was preparing the Serenity Chapel for a morning service when I discovered an elderly man sitting in the third row, wearing a black suit that looked like it might have been fashionable several decades ago. He was speaking quietly, but animatedly, occasionally chuckling as if sharing memories with someone beside him, though the chair next to him was empty. "Sir," I said, approaching with the same gentle caution I'd used before, "I'm sorry, but the building is closed. Visiting hours don't start until tomorrow morning." He looked up with a warm, grandfatherly smile and tipped his hat slightly. "Oh, good evening, young man. I was just visiting with Helen here." He gestured to the empty chair beside him. "We were married for 47 years, you know. I promised her I'd never miss a chance to see her, and I always keep my promises." I glanced at our service schedule. We had no Helen listed for current or recent services. "Sir, I think there might be some confusion about the timing or location. Can I call someone to help you get where you need to be?" "Nonsense," he said with a pleasant laugh. "Helen's funeral is today. I've been looking forward to seeing all the family again, hearing the stories about her garden and her famous apple pies. She'd be so pleased to know how many people came to remember her." He turned back toward the empty chair and continued speaking, as if carrying on a conversation with someone who was responding to his comments. "Helen, dear, this nice young man is concerned about us. Should we tell him about the roses you planted behind the house? The ones that still bloom every spring?" I felt a chill run down my spine as I realized he was waiting for responses that I couldn't hear, pausing at appropriate moments as if listening to replies from his deceased wife. His behavior wasn't the random rambling of dementia. It was the natural rhythm of two people who had spent decades finishing each other's sentences. When I returned with our director to help resolve the situation, the elderly man had vanished just as mysteriously as the woman before him. No signs of entry or exit, no explanation for how he had gotten into a locked building or where he had gone. Over the following months, I encountered similar visitors with increasing frequency. Always elderly, always well-dressed in clothing that seemed slightly out of date, always speaking to deceased loved ones as if they were present in the room. They would ask about funeral services for people who weren't on our schedule, mention details about lives and relationships that sounded authentic but couldn't be verified in our records. The pattern became clear. These weren't confused or disoriented people wandering into the wrong building. They were mourners who had somehow become disconnected from time, still attending funerals that had ended years or decades ago, still keeping vigil for people who had already been laid to rest. I began researching our funeral home's historical records, looking for names that matched the people my mysterious visitors claimed to be mourning. What I found was both fascinating and deeply unsettling. Every name they mentioned, Arthur, Helen, and dozens of others appeared in our records from the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. These elderly visitors weren't confused about current services. They were attending funerals that had taken place when they were younger, before age and time had taken their own toll. Somehow, they had become trapped in moments of grief so profound that they continued to replay them decades after the fact. The most disturbing encounter occurred on a December evening when I found the Serenity Chapel filled with nearly 30 elderly mourners, all sitting quietly and speaking in low voices to empty chairs and vacant spaces around the room. The scene looked like a normal funeral gathering, except that there was no casket, no flowers, and no actual people to mourn. As I stood in the doorway, paralyzed by the impossibility of what I was witnessing, one of the mournersa women in a vintage black dress with a pearl necklace noticed me and approached with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, dear," she said with genuine kindness. "Are you here for Margaret's service? I'm her sister Rose, and I wanted to make sure you knew that the family is receiving visitors in the side room after the ceremony. Margaret would have been so pleased that you came to pay your respects." I looked around the room at the gathered mourners, all of them engaged in quiet conversations with people I couldn't see, all of them participating in a funeral service that existed only in their collective memory. The absence was so palpable it felt like presences if the Serenity Chapel was hosting a gathering of spirits who had never learned to let go of their earthly connections. "When did Margaret pass away?" I asked, though I was afraid to hear the answer. "Oh, it was so sudden," Rose replied with genuine sadness. "Just last week. A heart attack in her sleep. She was only 67, you know. Far too young to leave us all behind." I checked our records the next morning and found Margaret's service listed in our files from 1972, over 50 years ago. Her sister Rose had been listed as one of the family members who had helped arrange the funeral, a young woman in her 30s who had died herself 15 years later. I continue working at Mercy Rest Funeral Home, but I've developed a different understanding of my role in the evening hours. The building serves not just the recently deceased and their immediate families, but also the generations of mourners who have passed through these rooms over the decades. Some grief is so profound that it transcends time, creating echoes that replay long after the original mourners have joined their loved ones. I no longer try to direct these evening visitors to exits or call for assistance. Instead, I quietly maintain the viewing rooms, ensuring they remain dignified spaces for whatever services are taking place, whether they're scheduled for tomorrow morning or whether they ended decades ago. Some people need more time to say goodbye than a single lifetime can provide, and I've learned that true hospitality means accommodating guests from any era who still need a place to gather and remember. Each evening, as I lock up the building, I can hear the soft murmur of conversations continuing in the Serenity Chapel voices, sharing memories, offering comfort, and maintaining the eternal bonds that death can interrupt but never truly break. In the morning, the rooms are always empty and properly arranged for the day's scheduled services, but the peace that lingers suggests that some farewells are worth repeating as many times as necessary. Some paperwork documents places that were never meant to be found. I'm Grace Holloway, and I've been the office administrator at Willowbrook Cemetery for 12 years. My job involves maintaining all the records that keep a cemetery functioning: plot sales, burial permits, maintenance schedules, and the endless documentation required by state regulations. It's meticulous work that requires attention to detail and absolute accuracy, because families depend on our records to locate their loved ones' graves for generations to come. Willowbrook spans 47 acres of gently rolling hills, dotted with mature oak and maple trees. The cemetery was established in 1922, and our records go back to the very first burial. Every plot sale, every interment, every maintenance request is documented in multiple system-handwritten ledgers from the early decades, typed records from the mid-century, and computerized databases from the 1980s onward. My office maintains all these records, cross-referencing them to ensure accuracy and accessibility. The cemetery is divided into clearly marked sections, A through M for the original areas, with newer sections numbered 1 through 6 for expansions added over the decades. Each section has a detailed map showing individual plot locations, and families receive copies of these maps when they purchase burial sites. The system has worked flawlessly for nearly a century, allowing groundskeepers to locate any grave quickly and helping families navigate to their loved ones' resting places. My daily routine involves updating records for new sales and burials, responding to family inquiries about plot locations, and maintaining the various databases that track every aspect of cemetery operations. I work closely with the funeral directors, groundskeepers, and families to ensure all documentation is accurate and complete. During slower periods, I digitize older records, converting handwritten ledgers into searchable electronic formats that will preserve the information for future generations. The first discrepancy appeared in our computer system during a routine audit in late September. The database showed plot sales for Section N, which caught my attention immediately because Willowbrook has never had a Section N. Our sections run A through M, then continue with numbered sections 1 through 6. There is no Section N on any of our official maps or planning documents. When I searched deeper into the records, I found 17 plot sales listed for Section N, all dating back to different periods over the past 20 years. The sales appeared to be legitimate. They included proper documentation, payment records, and family contact information. But according to every map and survey I could find, Section N simply doesn't exist. I assumed the entries were data entry errors, perhaps plots in Section M that had been mistyped as Section N. But when I cross-referenced the plot numbers with our Section M records, I found no duplicates or obvious mistakes. The Section N plots appeared to be entirely separate locations with their own unique identification numbers and coordinates. I brought the discrepancy to Mr. Davidson, the cemetery director, who reviewed the records with the same confusion I had experienced. He had been working at Willowbrook for 23 years and had no memory of any Section N. The cemetery's master development plan, filed with the county, showed no provision for additional lettered sections beyond M. "Grace," he said, studying the computer printouts, "this has to be some kind of database corruption. Maybe when we upgraded the computer system a few years ago, some records got scrambled or duplicated with incorrect section codes." That explanation made sense, so I began the process of identifying and correcting what I assumed were data errors. But when I tried to contact the families who had supposedly purchased plots in Section N, I discovered that the phone numbers and addresses in our records were all accurate and current. These weren't phantom entries or corrupted data, they were real families who had made real purchases. Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, listed as the buyer of plot N47, answered her phone on the second ring and confirmed that she had indeed purchased a burial plot at Willowbrook Cemetery 3 years earlier. She had the paperwork to prove it, including a detailed map showing the location of her plot in Section N. "It's a lovely spot," she told me over the phone, "under the oak trees, with a nice view of the pond. I visit sometimes to make sure the grass is being maintained properly. Is there some problem with my purchase?" I asked her to describe the location more specifically, but her directions didn't match any area I could identify on our official maps. She mentioned landmarks: a small pond, a cluster of old oak trees, a stone bench that weren't marked on any survey or maintenance chart I had access to. Over the following week, I contacted 6 more families with Section N plots. All of them confirmed their purchases and provided detailed descriptions of locations they had visited within the cemetery. But none of their descriptions matched areas that appeared on our official maps or aerial photographs. That's when I decided to conduct a physical survey of the cemetery grounds, walking every section to see if I could identify the areas these families were describing. I knew Willowbrook well from 12 years of working there, but I wanted to be systematic and thorough in my search for the mysterious Section N. I started with the most remote areas of the cemetery, places where additional sections might have been developed without my knowledge. At the far eastern edge of the property, beyond Section 6 and past the maintenance shed, I discovered a narrow path that led through a dense stand of trees. I had never noticed the path before, though I had walked past that area hundreds of times. The path led to a clearing that opened into what was unmistakably a cemetery section. Dozens of headstones stood in neat rows, surrounded by well-maintained grass and bordered by the oak trees that families had described. A small pond reflected the afternoon sunlight, and a weathered stone bench sat beneath the largest oak tree. But according to every map and survey in our files, this area didn't exist. I walked through the rows of headstones, checking names and dates against the Section N records in my office. Every grave matched the documentation perfectly. The names, the plot numbers, the family information all corresponded exactly to the sales records that had appeared mysteriously in our database. What disturbed me most were the dates on the headstones. While the plot sales had occurred over the past 20 years, every death date carved into the granite markers was from 1943. Not just the same year, but the same month, the same day, even the same hour, October 15th, 1943, 3:27 p.m. 17 people, ranging in age from 6 months to 84 years, had all died at exactly the same moment 79 years ago. Yet their families had purchased burial plots decades later, visiting graves that officially didn't exist in a section that appeared on no maps. I photographed the headstones and researched the names in historical records. What I discovered challenged everything I thought I understood about Willowbrook Cemetery's history. On October 15, 1943, a passenger train had derailed just outside town, killing 17 people in what was considered the worst transportation disaster in the county's history. The newspaper accounts from 1943 indicated that the victims had been buried in a temporary section of Willowbrook Cemetery while their families arranged for permanent interments. But according to the official records, all 17 bodies had been relocated to their families' home cemeteries within 6 months of the accident. Yet here they were, still resting in their temporary graves 79 years later, in a section of the cemetery that existed physically but appeared on no official documentation. Somehow, these 17 accident victims had been forgotten by the record keepers but remembered by families who continued to purchase plots and visit graves that shouldn't have been there. I returned to Section N the following afternoon with Mr. Davidson, determined to show him the physical evidence of the mysterious burial area. But when we followed the path through the trees, we found only an empty clearing, with no headstones, no graves, and no signs that the area had ever been used for burials. "Grace," Mr. Davidson said gently, "there's nothing here, just trees and grass." But I had photographs on my phone from the previous day clear images of headstones with names and dates that matched our Section N records exactly. When I showed him the pictures, he stared at them in confusion, then looked back at the empty clearing. "These photos were taken here?" he asked. "Yesterday afternoon?" I nodded, but as I looked at my phone screen, the images were fading before my eyes. The headstones became translucent, then disappeared entirely, leaving only photographs of empty grass and trees. Within minutes, my phone showed no evidence that Section N had ever existed. I continue working at Willowbrook Cemetery, maintaining records that include 17 plot sales for a section that appears and disappears according to some schedule I don't understand. The families who purchase plots in Section N still call occasionally to ask about maintenance or to confirm visiting hours, and I give them the information they need without mentioning that their loved ones rest in graves that exist only sometimes. Some afternoons, when the light slants through the trees at the eastern edge of the property, I can see the path that leads to Section N. But I've learned not to follow it, because some records document places that were never meant to be permanent. The 17 passengers from that 1943 train derailment are still waiting for their families to relocate them to their final resting places, still occupying temporary graves that exist only when someone needs to visit them. The paperwork in my office continues to show sales for plots that can't be found on any map, and I've stopped trying to reconcile the discrepancies. Sometimes the most important records are the ones that document what should have been, rather than what officially is. And sometimes, the best administration involves maintaining files for places that exist only in the space between memory and documentation, where the dead wait patiently for the living to remember where they left them. Some conversations begin long after the talking should have stopped. I'm Ben Rodriguez, and I've been working as a mortuary technician at Highland Funeral Home for 8 years. It's technical work that requires precision and respect, preparing bodies for viewing, maintaining equipment, and ensuring every detail meets the standards families deserve during their most difficult times. The funeral home operates 24 hours a day because death doesn't follow a schedule, and someone needs to be available whenever families need our services. My shift runs from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., handling the overnight preparations and maintenance that keep the facility running smoothly. During these quiet hours, I work in the basement preparation rooms, managing the embalming processes, cleaning equipment, and organizing the storage areas where we keep supplies and caskets before services. The work is methodical and peaceful, and I've always found satisfaction in the precise attention to detail that helps families say goodbye with dignity. The basement level includes 3 preparation rooms, a storage area for supplies, and a large climate-controlled room where we keep caskets before they're needed for services. The casket storage room maintains constant temperature and humidity to preserve the material's wood, metal, and fabric components that need to remain in perfect condition for families who are already dealing with more stress than anyone should have to bear. We typically stock 12 to 15 caskets at any given time, ranging from simple pine boxes for families with limited budgets to elaborate hardwood and metal caskets for those who want more elaborate services. Each casket is carefully positioned on wheeled carts that allow us to move them easily when families come to make selections or when we need to transport them to the preparation rooms. The storage room has excellent acoustics, a side effect of the climate control systems, and the way sound travels through the basement's concrete construction. During my overnight shifts, I can hear every mechanical noise from the building's systems, the hum of refrigeration units, the cycling of air handlers, and the occasional settling sounds that old buildings make as temperatures change. That's why I noticed the tapping immediately when it started 3 weeks ago. It was a Tuesday night around 2 a.m. when I first heard the soft, rhythmic sound coming from the casket storage room. 3 distinct taps, a pause of several seconds, then 3 more taps. The pattern repeated with mechanical precision, always the same interval between groups, always exactly 3 taps per sequence. My first thought was that one of the casket carts had developed a mechanical problem, maybe a loose wheel or a failing bearing that was creating rhythmic noise as the building's vibrations caused it to move slightly. I went into the storage room and checked each casket carefully, looking for signs of movement or mechanical failure. All 12 caskets were properly positioned and secure. The wheels on their carts were locked. The storage room was completely still, and I could find no source for the tapping sound. But as I stood in the center of the room listening, the pattern continued. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps. The sound seemed to come from inside the caskets themselves, as if someone was tapping gently on the interior surfaces. But that was impossible. These were display models, empty caskets used only for family selection and funeral services. None of them contained bodies or any other contents that could produce sound. I opened several of the caskets and examined their interiors carefully. The padding and lining materials were all in perfect condition, with no loose components that could create noise. The hardware was properly secured, and there were no signs of damage or wear that might cause mechanical sounds. But even with the caskets open, the tapping continued. 3 soft, deliberate taps, followed by silence. Then the pattern repeated. The sound was coming from somewhere within the room, but I couldn't identify the source, despite checking every possible component multiple times. Over the following nights, the tapping became a regular feature of my shift. It always started around 2 a.m. and continued for several hours before stopping completely around dawn. The pattern never varied. 3 taps, pause. 3 taps, pause, with the same rhythm and timing every night. I mentioned the sound to David, the day shift technician, but he had never noticed anything unusual in the storage room. I asked him to listen carefully during his shifts, but he reported only normal building sounds and mechanical noise from the climate control systems. Maybe it's the expansion and contraction of the materials, David suggested. These caskets are made from different woods and metals, and temperature changes can cause them to make sounds as they adjust to the environment. That explanation made sense, except for the regularity and specificity of the pattern. Thermal expansion and contraction would produce random creaks and pops, not the precise, rhythmic tapping I was hearing every night. I began keeping detailed notes about the timing and characteristics of the sound, hoping to identify some correlation with building systems or environmental conditions. But the tapping followed its own schedule, independent of heating cycles, humidity changes, or any other mechanical patterns I could track. After 2 weeks of documentation, I noticed something that changed my understanding of what I was hearing. The pattern was evolving. While it still consisted of groups of 3 taps separated by pauses, the intervals between groups were becoming more varied. Sometimes there would be a longer pause, sometimes shorter, as if whoever was creating the sound was experimenting with different rhythms. By the 3rd week, the tapping had developed into something that resembled communication attempts. Long pauses would be followed by rapid sequences of 3-tap groups, as if someone was trying to convey urgency or emphasis. Other times, the tapping would be slow and deliberate, with extended silences that felt almost contemplative. I began responding to the pattern, tapping back on the storage room wall in similar 3-tap sequences. The response was immediate and unmistakable. The tapping from inside the caskets would pause, then resume with what seemed like acknowledgmenta, single, softer tap, followed by the regular 3-tap pattern. That's when I realized I was engaging in some form of dialogue with whatever was producing the sound. The tapping wasn't random noise or mechanical failure. It was an attempt at communication from someone or something that had found a way to interact with the physical world through the storage room's unique acoustics. I started varying my responses, trying different patterns to see how the tapping would change. When I tapped 4 times instead of 3, the response would be 4 taps. When I created complex rhythms, the answering taps would mirror them with increasing accuracy, as if learning through repetition. The most disturbing development came during my shift on Friday night. I had been experimenting with Morse code, tapping out simple letters to see if the response would show recognition of the pattern. After several attempts at spelling basic words, I tapped out who in Morse code. 3 short, 2 long, 2 long. The storage room fell completely silent for nearly 5 minutes. Then, slowly and deliberately, Tapping came from inside one of the caskets near the back wall. 3 short, 2 long. 2 long, perfect Morse code for who. But it didn't stop there. The tapping continued with a response that made my blood run cold. 2 long, 1 short, 2 short, 1 short, 1 long Morse code for David. David Patterson had been a client of Highland Funeral Home 6 months earlier, a 42-year-old man who had died suddenly of a heart attack, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. I had prepared his body for viewing and had assisted with his funeral service. His casket had been the same model as the one from which the Morse code response was coming. I ran upstairs to check our client records, confirming what I already suspected. David Patterson's service had been held in our main chapel, and his casket had been positioned in the exact spot where the communicating casket now sat in our storage room. When I returned to the basement, the tapping had stopped completely. The storage room was silent, and it remained silent for the rest of my shift. But I knew something fundamental had changed. The sounds weren't coming from mechanical failures or building systems. They were coming from someone who had found a way to maintain some form of presence in the place where his body had been prepared for its final journey. I continue working the overnight shift at Highland Funeral Home, but I no longer try to identify the source of sounds that come from the storage room. Some nights there's tapping, sometimes in patterns that suggest different individuals trying to communicate. Other nights, there are different sound, soft whispers, gentle scratching, or the sound of movement from within caskets that I know are empty. I've learned to acknowledge these sounds without fear, understanding that the storage room serves a purpose beyond simply holding caskets before services. It's a way station where some spirits linger briefly, perhaps trying to understand their transition, or seeking some form of closure before moving on to whatever comes next. The families who come to Highland Funeral Home trust us to treat their loved ones with dignity and respect. What they don't know is that sometimes that care extends beyond the traditional boundaries of our service. Sometimes the dead need time to adjust to their new circumstances, and sometimes they need someone to listen when they're ready to say goodbye in their own way. Each morning, as I finish my shift, I tap 3 times softly on the storage room. Voila, gentle acknowledgement of whoever might be listening. A sign that someone remembers they were here and understands they may need time to find their way to whatever peace awaits them. Some promises are kept long after the one who made them has forgotten how to age. I'm Ann Fitzgerald, and I've been the head caretaker at Elmwood Cemetery for 16 years. It's a position that requires both physical stamina and emotional sensitivity, maintaining the grounds where families come to remember their loved ones while preserving the dignity of those who can no longer speak for themselves. Elmwood spans 53 acres and has been serving our community since 1879, making it one of the oldest cemeteries in the county. My work begins before dawn, checking the grounds for damage from weather or vandalism, tending to landscaping needs, and ensuring that every section of the cemetery reflects the respect that families deserve when they visit. The newer sections require regular maintenance, grass cutting, flower bed weeding, and headstone cleaning, but the older areas need more specialized care. Some sections date back over a century, and the aging monuments require careful attention to preserve them for future generations. The oldest section of Elmwood sits on a hill overlooking the main grounds, bordered by ancient oak trees that were mature when the first burials took place. This area contains some of the cemetery's most historically significant graves, including founding families and Civil War veterans. Many of the headstones are weathered limestone and marble that require gentle cleaning techniques to avoid damage, and some graves have markers so worn that the inscriptions are barely legible. What makes the oldest section particularly challenging is the number of unmarked graves burial sites where headstones have been lost to time, weather, or family circumstances that prevented proper memorialization. Cemetery records from the late 1800s were sometimes incomplete, and some families couldn't afford permanent markers for their loved ones. These graves are still sacred ground, but they lack the identifying information that helps families locate and tend to their ancestors' resting places. My routine includes a weekly walk through the oldest section, checking for maintenance needs and documenting any changes or concerns. It's peaceful work that connects me to the history of our community, and I've always felt a special responsibility to care for the unmarked graves that no longer have family members to tend them. That's why I noticed the flowers immediately when they first appeared 3 months ago. On a Tuesday morning in late August, I found a small bouquet of white orchids placed on one of the unmarked graves near the center of the oldest section. The flowers were clearly expensive, the kind of exotic blooms that required special care and considerable cost. They were perfectly fresh, with no signs of wilting despite having been outside overnight. Attached to the orchids was a small piece of paper, folded carefully and tucked under the ribbon that bound the stems. The note contained a single sentence, written in careful, childlike handwriting, "I remember you." My first assumption was that a family member had located an ancestor's grave and was beginning to tend it regularly. But when I checked the cemetery records, that particular plot showed no burial information. It was simply marked as occupied, unmarked in our files from the early 1900s. I left the flowers in place, thinking that whoever had left them might return with more information about the grave's occupant. But when I returned the following Tuesday, I found the original orchids had been replaced with fresh white roses, also expensive varieties, also accompanied by a note reading, "I remember you," in the same childlike handwriting. This pattern continued weekly for over a month. Every Tuesday, I would find fresh flowers on the unmarked grave, sometimes orchids, sometimes roses, occasionally exotic lilies or rare peonies. All were premium varieties that would have cost considerable money, and all were accompanied by the same simple message in careful, young handwriting. I began arriving earlier on Tuesday mornings, hoping to encounter whoever was leaving the flowers. But the bouquets always appeared sometime between my Monday evening check and my early Tuesday arrival, as if placed during the overnight hours when the cemetery was officially closed. What bothered me most was the quality and variety of the flowers. I was familiar with all the local florists and garden centers, and none of them carried the exotic varieties that were appearing weekly on the unmarked grave. When I asked around, several shop owners confirmed that they hadn't sold those particular types of flowers in years. Some varieties hadn't been available locally since the 1990s. I decided to research the specific location of the grave to see if I could identify who might be buried there. The cemetery's historical records were incomplete, but I found references to several burials in that section during the 1880s and 90s. One entry caught my attention, a notation about a young girl named Emma Charlotte Hartwell, age 7, buried in 1891 after dying from scarlet fever. According to the sparse records, Emma had been the daughter of a prominent local family, but financial difficulties following her father's death had prevented them from purchasing a permanent headstone. The grave had been marked only with a wooden cross that had long since deteriorated, leaving no visible sign of Emma's resting place. I began paying closer attention to the notes that accompanied the flowers, looking for any clues about who might be leaving them. The handwriting was consistently that of a young child, the kind of careful, deliberate lettering that comes from someone who is still learning to form letters properly. But the paper was modern, and the pencil marks showed no signs of aging that would indicate the notes were old. The mystery deepened when I tried to identify the specific varieties of flowers that were being left. Several were species that had been popular in formal gardens during the late 1800s, but had fallen out of cultivation by the mid-20th century. A local historian confirmed that these particular orchids and roses had been common in Victorian-era gardens, but were no longer commercially available. Those varieties would have been exactly what wealthy families planted in their memorial gardens during the 1890s, she told me, but you'd have to grow them yourself from heritage stock to get flowers like that today. No commercial nursery has carried them for decades. The most disturbing development came during my Tuesday morning check in early November. Instead of finding fresh flowers on Emma's unmarked grave, I discovered a small bouquet of white roses that appeared to be from the 1890s, not reproductions or heritage varieties, but actual flowers that showed the characteristics of 19th century cultivation techniques. The petals had the slightly different texture and coloring that came from older growing methods, and the stems showed evidence of hand cutting rather than modern commercial harvesting. These weren't contemporary flowers that resembled historical varieties. They were actual antique flowers that somehow remained perfectly preserved and fresh. As I knelt to examine the roses more closely, I noticed something that made my hands tremble. The ribbon binding the stems was silk with a particular weave pattern that I recognized from museum exhibits about Victorian mourning customs. This wasn't modern craft ribbon made to look antiquated, was actual 19th century silk, aged but perfectly preserved. The note attached to these impossible flowers was different too. Instead of the usual, "I remember you," this message read, "Thank you for taking care of my garden, Miss Anne. I promised I would always bring flowers for the forgotten ones." It was signed in the same childlike handwriting, "Emma Charlotte Hartwell, age 7, 1891. I sat back on my heels, staring at the note and the impossible flowers. The signature was exactly the same as the one I had found in the cemetery's historical records, the careful signature of a 7-year-old girl who had died over a century ago, practicing the formal penmanship that children of wealthy families learned in the 1890s. That evening, I returned to Emma's grave just before sunset, hoping to understand what I was witnessing. As the light began to fade, I saw a small figure kneeling beside the unmarked burial site, young girl in a white dress that seemed to shimmer in the twilight. She was carefully arranging fresh flowers around the grave, speaking in soft tones as if comforting someone she couldn't see. "Don't worry," she whispered to the empty air above the grave. "I know no one else remembers your name, but I do. I'll keep bringing flowers so you won't be forgotten." The girl looked up and saw me watching from behind one of the old oak trees. Her face was kind and serious, with the solemn expression that children sometimes develop when they understand responsibility beyond their years. "Hello, Miss Anne," she said with perfect politeness. "Thank you for keeping the old section so neat and pretty. It makes it easier for me to find everyone who needs flowers." She gestured toward other unmarked graves scattered throughout the oldest section, and I realized that each one had a small bouquet of antique flowers that I had somehow failed to notice during my routine checks. "I promised I would remember them," Emma continued, "and I always keep my promises. Even when I can't grow up anymore, I can still bring flowers." As the last light faded from the sky, Emma's figure became translucent, then disappeared entirely, leaving only the fresh bouquet of impossible flowers and the echo of a 7-year-old girl's solemn vow to never let the forgotten dead remain unmarked and unremembered. I continue working at Elmwood Cemetery, and I continue finding fresh flowers on unmarked graves throughout the oldest section. The notes still appear weekly, always in Emma's careful, childlike handwriting, always expressing her determination to remember those whom time has forgotten. I've stopped questioning the impossibility of century-old flowers that remain fresh or trying to explain how a 7-year-old girl who died in 1891 continues to keep her promise to tend the graves of the forgotten. Some responsibilities transcend death, and some promises are so pure they create their own reality. Emma Charlotte Hartwell made a vow to remember the forgotten dead, and she has kept that promise faithfully for over a century, ensuring that no grave in the oldest section of Elmwood Cemetery remains entirely without care or recognition. Each Tuesday morning, I find her flowers and read her notes, knowing that somewhere beyond the boundary between childhood and eternity, a 7-year-old girl continues her work as the guardian of memories that would otherwise be lost forever.